Hello, this is a single malt review, and today we're back in Scotland, but this time it's a blend.
And we are continuing, albeit tenuously, the American theme of late, because this is none other than Cutty Sark's Prohibition blend. And as far as I know, there was not a prohibition in Scotland at any point. So they must be making allusions to the American market, where I'll bet this one is somewhat aimed at. This I got in duty free, but
There's a serious hint of the Americas in the labelling here. We're bottled at 100 proof for 50% ABV. A pure bourbon matured whiskey, which is, rather a blend of bourbon cask matured Scotch and grain.
In what ratio and what they've used, I wouldn't be able to even hazard a guess. I can find really very little about this whiskey online beyond that it's fairly well considered, which I broadly agree with. But we'll get there. What it is, which stands it above your average Cutty Sark immediately, is as Dave said, 50%, which is good solid strength. It's unchill filtered and uncoloured. So that's a bit of a revolution all at once for a blended whiskey. So that was sort of what spurred me to pick it up.
That's impressively dark for a bourbon matured spirit as well.
Yes, it is. I'm just going to subtly adjust the microphone there. Look at that. Look. Don't look at that. There we go. Now look at that. Very it's a pretty solid product, actually, for a budget whiskey, and it is kind of a budget whiskey. This is no more expensive than, not much more expensive than standard Cutty Sark, all told. Certainly cheaper than Cutty Sark 12-year-old, given that it comes in a litre bottle at 50%. You're getting quite a lot of whiskey value in there, and I don't think it's a bad drop at all. It's maybe it's young. You can say that with a lot of confidence. There's a distinct hit of very young malt spirit on the nose there. So what age it might be, I'm not absolutely sure. But that said, if it really is truly marketing itself as a reproduction Prohibition era whiskey, that's not at all untrue. That would have been very, very young whiskey, maybe younger than this. They made all these things into sugary cocktails like old fashions and whatnot for a reason, because the liquor itself, although most of it was Canadian whiskey, it wasn't Scotch whiskey. It was much cheaper to just haul it across the Canadian border than all the way across the Atlantic. But anyway, close enough, we will say. A lot of it was really pretty young and pretty raw. That's why there was such a rocking cocktail scene there, to improve it into something you might actually want to drink. This one, though it'll make a hell of an old-fashioned, I'll tell you that right now, doesn't need that treatment. This is a pretty solid whiskey all of its own. And since they've said it's uncoloured, we can actually take some stock of that colour and say that's a pretty healthy look for something that we know is 100% bourbon matured. That's a pretty rich colour.
Yeah, that's a very... In fact, that combined with the nose, I would swear there was a sherry influence here if they didn't tell us otherwise on the label.
So slightly confusing, but who knows? That sort of colour you really wouldn't expect to see from really most blends that don't have colouring in them. They'd be very, very pale in comparison. This one is not. This one has quite a hearty colour going for it. And that heartiness, as we will find out, is going to be a bit of a continuing theme with this whiskey.
Any clues as to whose whiskies have gone into this blend?
You would have to look up what tends to go into Cutty Sark, which is there's a bit of Macallan, a bit of Glenrothes, other bits and pieces. I'd have to go and look up a list somewhere. It's a Edrington Group blend, and so you'd have to see what their sort of stable of distilleries is, and then subsequent to that, what traditionally goes into Cutty Sark, because it will be a standard sort of range of whiskies. This one, I think I can smell. I think there's a good bit of Macallan in here, and I think that's where some of this heavy, sort of maybe pseudo-sherried, if not sherried, character is coming from, because Macallan is quite a signature malt in the Cutty Sark blends. But
there's maybe very little peat, possibly none, but I'm able to distinguish.
A thread, if any, but for such a punchy and grainy whiskey, we should say, there's a lot of grain dominance in this whiskey. It's very much, as much of a robust and progressive product as it is with the unchill filtered coloured good high strength. It's very, very grainy. They're not shy about the quantity of grain in here. I think it's at least 60% grain gone in here. Was I to hazard a guess? But all of that said, it's not an unpleasant nose. It's very, very sweet. It's fairly simple. It's just a little bit spicy. And you'd say uncomplicated, I think. There's not a lot to really think about too much in the nose. But the palate, I think, is a bit more interesting. What's it speaking to you of?
Okay, but initial sip at full 50% ABV strength. It's quite spicy, it's very harsh, it is extremely grain forward. It's really dominated by that grain spirit. I'm a little dubious, a little disappointed initially by the sheer amount of grain influence there. Good bourbon characters, as one would hope from 100% bourbon matured whiskey, but I'm a little wary so far. I'm going to have to try with
there's
generous addition of water.
A lot of vanilla, some coconut, both of those coming from those bourbon wood. There's quite a lot of spice because grain spirit is quite spicy. It's not unlike rye spirit, which is of course a grain spirit itself. It has a lot of those flavours I find if I'm looking to spot it. That sort of gentle, sweet spiciness is something that a grain spirit often brings. And this has it in spades, almost I think maybe one spade too many, as Dave says. It's just a little soft. It's gone a bit squashy in the palate. It could use a few more straight edges on it to really give it some definition, but let's see what it's like with a bit of water, which you can certainly take, given its youthfulness and its strength.
The taste notes on the bottle refer to black pepper and toffee. Black pepper, certainly, there's that raw, spicy fire. Okay, I've had a generous amount of water there. The smell is softened, though otherwise more or less unchanged. Nothing new has emerged.
To me, it's... whether it's done it a favour or not, I'm not sure, but it's made the already young spirit that much more youthful, to the point where it's beginning to taste just a little bit industrial, or at least in the nose, it's become a bit industrial. I haven't really investigated the palate just yet. Let's see.
Tried it now with the addition of water. That has taken away that grain harshness, but what it's left behind is just... It's some sweet, chewy caramel. If you remember a Jersey caramel, again, possibly a very local confectionery reference there, but I'm slightly sad. There's nothing to that but that chewy caramel flavour. It's some confectionery, some slightly milky, buttery sweets.
There's a little fruitiness which the water has brought out. I'll just put in a wee bit more.
Even the vanilla has diminished slightly now that there's water in there. It's sadly empty as far as my palate is concerned anyway.
It's certainly not a whiskey of a great many dimensions. I think as far as dimensions goes, this really has only two. It has the bourbon wood, which is quite fresh, quite punchy, and it was always going to be from that colour. Quite fresh, quite active bourbon wood in here. And the other dimension is really largely dominated by that very heavy grain whiskey influence, which all comes together to be a fairly simple whiskey. There's not a lot of nuance here. It's not unpleasant, it's just not particularly cerebral, given what we normally like to taste. These sort of magnificently complex single casks and things like that, which we so often encounter. All of this, I think, is fairly well in keeping with the theme of the whiskey, this whole prohibition blend nature of it. It's maybe to a fault, very, very faithfully aping the style of whiskey that you would have seen back then. And so it's maybe not what you're used to, or not what you're expecting as a drinker of modern Scotch whiskey.
Yeah, if I was living in the US during the 20s and this was being smuggled in across the Atlantic, this would be great Scotch. I'd be pleased with it. But as it is, though, for something... We've had some truly exceptional all bourbon matured Scotch before, but this, I would expect something similar from this, but it's just not delivering for me. Maybe it's that heavy grain influence, or something is lacking though. It's lacking a lot.
I think the main thing it's lacking is in complexity and nuance. It's just a very, very simplistic whiskey, which, as I said, maybe a little too authentic for the modern palate, which is maybe looking for something a little bit more. It's looking for some subtlety. It's looking for some complexity, which, funnily enough, the Cutty Sark 12-year-old and particularly the 18-year-old really, really has. Those, I think, are some quite thoughtful blended whiskies. Difficult to find these days, particularly the 18, and not humongously affordable either. So it may be a wee while until I can manage to review one. But this one, quite a different beast. It's a very primary whisky, and I think, just like the original Prohibition whiskies, this is more aimed at the drinker of whiskies that isn't too... not hugely, they don't want to have a cerebral experience with the whiskey, or they might want to mix it. This one, I can confirm, is a really good mixer. It's a good mixer, and it's good with a bit of cold water or a nice ice cube. It's good drinking whiskey. It's quite moorish, it's not overcomplicated. I think there's two ways, and I doubt either of them are ever going to happen, that this whiskey could be manifestly improved. I think if they found a source of peated whiskey and added just a thread in there, just a little bit of beguiling peat, I think would manifestly improve the profile of this whiskey, because it would frame these rather simple flavours and stop them just completely blotting the image, which they're doing at the moment.
A bourbon matured Kaolila, for instance. There are some exquisite examples there.
That, I think, would manifestly improve it. The other thing, which I would be very excited to see, would be a vatted malt version of this. Having recently tasted Elfie's Glenborrowdale, I'm sort of on a bit of a kick for blended malts, and I think a all malt version of a lovely sort of primary robust whiskey like this would be really quite excellent, and wouldn't have that sort of overly soft blowout that this is suffering from all that grain whiskey. I think I'm quite unlikely to ever see either of those two things, because I think this is probably selling extremely well, because the market for cocktail whiskey and the market for Scotch on the rocks is enormous. It's going to be decades before that is in any way threatened by the single malt market. That's still this sort of maybe 10% of the industry, if that. So I probably won't get my way there, but if anyone's listening out there, that's something that I'd be right in front of the queue to have a look at. As it is, scores-wise, I think I'd call it a solid whiskey, but I wouldn't call it a fine whiskey. That's a 72 from me.
I'll have to go somewhat lower. This one gets a 65 from me. It's not a bad whiskey as such, but the things which it does well, the things which make it good, are relatively few and far between. It's lacking in nuance, it's lacking in character, strength, intensity, all things you'd expect from something that's got what should otherwise have something to say, really. Being 100% bourbon matured, it should have some clear, strong characters, but whether it's some quirk of maturation of a whiskey mix or the amount of grain alcohol that's gone in there, it is just lacking. I mean, it would substitute well for bourbon in any kind of a mix or cocktail that you might normally use bourbon in. That'd be a great application for it. I'll say that in its defence. But as a whiskey to enjoy on its own, it's sadly limited.
So, well, there you are. Take it for what it is, I think. Very, very faithful to a very old-fashioned style of whiskey, but as a modern one, just be aware of what you're in for. However, all of that said, if you want a good, robust, strong, 50% ABV and uncoloured, unchill filtered whiskey for the purposes of cocktails, this would be all but my go-to. This and Glenfarclas cask strength, that would be sort of the two I'd have there. And this, I think, may even be more versatile because of that lack of strikingly individual character. It will attune itself to any particular sweeter citrus cocktail, be it a Manhattan or an old-fashioned. I think that'd be both perfect ones for this one. This would be your man, I think. So certainly has its arenas, this one, but it's probably not what you're after when you really want to have a good think about the whiskey you're drinking. So there you have it for that one. That's Cutty Sark's Prohibition Blend, or Prohibition Edition. I'm not sure if this is batched or if this is sort of set in stone and this is simply how it's going to be. It's not listed on the thing. This, I think, has room to be revised, and I think they probably will revise it based on feedback in the future. So
it's a little less grain, a little more peat, just something more complex.
I think
add
we
some
can...
layers.
It'd be a whiskey to watch. I think in 2 or 3 years we may have a different blend of this coming out. Whether they say it's version 2 or whether it simply creeps along and changes naturally, as these things tend to do. I think it will be maybe worth a revisit. So we will keep it on the list until then. In the meantime, this has been the Single Malt Review. I hope this was informative as always. We will go and have a rummage in the shelf to find you something compelling for next time. In the meantime, stay safe, Slunjo.